Washington Talk, I'm In-jung Cho. North Korea says it has tested a new solid-fuel intermediate-range hypersonic missile. President Biden will welcome Japanese Prime Minister Kishida to the White House, and they are expected to discuss ways to upgrade the military alliance. Today, we discuss the security and deterrence in Northeast Asia.
북한의 탄도미사일 발사는 다수의 안보리 결의에 대한 위반이고 한반도와 국제사회의 평화, 안정을 심각하게 위협하는
the United States and Japan to work more collaboratively on joint development, potentially co-production of vital military and defense equipment.
In the studio with me, Mr. Christopher Johnstone, Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Johnstone was the Director for East Asia at the National Security Council under President Biden. He also served as the Director for Japan and Oceanian Affairs at the NSC, Principal Director for South and Southeast Asia, as well as Director for Northeast Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Also joining us, Dr. Michael O. Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. He also serves as the member of the Defense Policy Board at the U.S. Department of Defense. He is the author of The Crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, Mr. Johnstone, North Korea claims to have successfully tested intermediate-range solid-fuel hypersonic missile. Now, Kim Jong-un, who oversaw the launch, said that the test has completed the North project to put all the tactical, operational, and strategic missiles of various ranges on a solid-fuel, warhead-controlled, and nuclear warhead-carrying basis. South Korean military says that North Korea may be exaggerating. How much credibility do you give to this claim?
They're almost certainly exaggerating the capabilities. History is full of examples of North Korea exaggerating its capabilities. But history also tells us that the North Koreans have a record of learning and improving their capabilities. When you look at the growth and capability of their ICBM force, the development of shorter range systems, full spectrum of capabilities, there's no question that there's been progress. I was in Tokyo when North Korea launched the Taepodong 2 missile in 2006, and that missile sat on the pad for weeks. When they finally launched it, it failed seconds after launch. So when you think about where we are today with the Hwasong 18 and other capabilities, certainly there's been progress. But I think it's also important to emphasize, and we'll come back to this, deterrence is still strong on the Korean Peninsula, and these capabilities are not going to make North Korea more secure.
Dr. O'Hanlon, the new missile that North Korea has tested was topped with glide vehicle that did vertical maneuvers after being detached from the rocket. Do you think North Korea has this capability? And does this open a hole in the missile defense of the USFK and ROK military?
Thank you. And Chris's comments are excellent and frame this very well, that we have to assume that North Korea may be exaggerating, but is certainly improving. And they do overperform in rocket technology compared to what you would expect for a country of that size and technological sophistication overall. But I would say the way I think about hypersonics is to break it down into sort of 3 component technologies or 3 levels of capability. And my guess is the North Koreans have made progress against some of those, but not all of them. First of all, we all have hypersonics. Hypersonics simply means very fast, 5 times the speed of sound. Any medium to long-range ballistic missile is hypersonic by definition. However, as you point out, what we're really interested in these days is the type of hypersonic weapon that can maneuver on the way down. And maneuvering to affect the trajectory enough that an interceptor might be thrown off course is not super hard. It's not easy, because if you deploy a fin that at high speed, the fin could be blown off, could be destroyed. It takes a fair amount of testing, which is why we're still working hard at hypersonic missiles in the United States. We consider this a very hard technology for us. And we spend $150 billion a year on military research, development, test, and evaluation. But the third thing I would guess the North Koreans have not yet done is to make a hypersonic missile that can maneuver carefully to a target. That's the hardest job of all. So hypersonic first just means going fast. They can do that. Hypersonic second means deviating from a predictable trajectory, making the defense's job harder. They might be able to do some of that. And the third area, maneuvering to a place that you really want to be to strike a specific target, that's super hard. That's what we're still working in the United States in the 2020s to advance. And my guess is they cannot yet do that. But that's just a guess.
Even Russian Kinzhal missile has not perfected that maneuverability.
Correct. Yeah, this is very hard.
Now, Mr. Johnstone, North Korea has focused on developing on the short-range KN-2324 and ICBM Hwasong-18, as you have touched upon earlier. Pyongyang has made progress in the solid fuel propellant and maneuverability a little bit, but has been relatively stagnant in developing intermediate-range missiles. Now that North Korea claims to have tested successfully intermediate-range missile equipped with solid fuel propellant, how does that change the threat level to the U.S. forces and the countries in the region? And how can this intermediate-range missile create synergy with the more advanced short-range and long-range missiles that North Koreans have?
Yeah, it's certainly a concern. But as Dr. O'Hanlon said, no doubt there's still a ways to go before they have a real capability. Should they bring it online, it potentially places Guam at greater risk, potentially Hawaii as well. But here again, I go back to the question of deterrence and whether this capability in any way meaningfully changes the deterrence equation on the peninsula and in the region, and I just don't think it does. The United States has substantial and significant strike capability deployed forward, and the recent B-52 flights sort of demonstrate the global reach of U.S. strategic assets. You've got the ROC itself has significant missile forces. Japan is now acquiring long-range strike systems. So there's a robust deterrent in the region, even as the North Koreans continue to work on these kinds of capabilities. So for me, what this does is reinforce the importance of deepening the U.S.-Japan ROC relationship. That, to me, is the foundation of deterrence against these proliferating systems of different ranges, demonstrating that we're standing as one and capable of responding as one is key. So that's, I think, the part of the response going forward.
But is that deterrence work after North Korean missile makes a landfall or before? What's the use of deterrence after the missile strikes any country?
Well, once they use force, then obviously it's on the United States and our allies to respond. And the administration has been very clear on this, that any use of nuclear weapons against the United States or its allies will result in the end of the regime. That's strong language, and I think just drives home this picture that despite this work, deterrence is still strong on the peninsula.
So you mentioned that any use of North Korean weapons, so meaning that there is nothing much can be done before use.
What I mean is that the administration is signaling very clearly that the cost of use, the cost of a North Korean decision to use nuclear weapons, to strike either the United States or its allies, would be overwhelming. It would be the end of Kim Jong-un's regime itself.
Well, as Dr. Johnstone has said, there is already a robust deterrent that I think remains, because the bottom line is if war happens, all bets are off as to how it ends, and chances are the North Korean regime winds up being overthrown. And I think Kim Jong-un knows that.
Mr. Johnstone, one country particularly concerned about North Korean missiles is Japan, and Prime Minister Kishida will meet with President Biden on the 10th in the White House. What led to this meeting of summits, and how is the security and diplomatic and economic situation different from previous summits?
Yeah, it's a big visit. This is an equivalent of a state visit, not technically a state visit, because Kishida is a head of government, not a head of state. But it's the first such visit since 2015, when Prime Minister Abe visited Washington. And it's only the fifth state visit that President Biden has held at the White House. 4 of those, incidentally, have been with Indo-Pacific partners, all the members of the Quad, and of course, President Yoon last year. So I think that by itself speaks to the focus on the Indo-Pacific of this administration. And I think I would say, You know, for this White House, Kishida has been a significant leader. The decision to basically double defense spending, the strong support for Ukraine in responding to the Russian invasion, leadership at the G7 last year, all of these things have made Japan a significant partner of the United States. And I think fundamental to that is a pretty difficult security environment in East Asia, right? The rise of China, of course, the growing concerns about Chinese revisionism, the North Korean threat that we've talked about here, now Russia. All of this is in the backdrop of a rapidly strengthening U.S.-Japan relationship. And by the way, also a U.S.-ROC strengthening relationship. I mean, this is a common pattern. And I'd note President Marcos of the Philippines is joining the two leaders in the White House the next day on the 11th. And that speaks to how allies across the board in Asia are responding to what they see as a challenging security environment.
And Dr. O'Hanlon, as an ally, what role does the United States expect from Japan in countering PRC's aggressive actions? And do you think the perception of threat areas and threat level is completely aligned between Washington and Tokyo?
I think in the abstract, the answer is largely yes. That in recent planning, for example, on defense, and as Dr. Johnstone says, Japan is spending more, but they're also spending more on the southwest of their own territory. And they're thinking more about Taiwan Strait or East China Sea, Senkaku Island contingencies. And I think they understand that if there were a war over Taiwan, there's a very good chance that Japanese territory and or territorial waters could be implicated very quickly. So even if Japan wanted to try to sit out that kind of a war, it might not have a very easy time doing so. So I think when we think about it in those kind of general terms, there's a lot of alignment. If you have a specific crisis, however, I don't think the world knows. I don't think we individually in our own brains know how we will wake up the next day if the United States and China really are on the brink of war. Because we're on the brink of World War III if that happens. And you and I are not safe in Washington if that happens. There's all bets are off as to what that kind of a war would mean. And so I don't think we can predict what different attempts at diplomacy, at conflict resolution, or at conflict de-escalation might be undertaken. And because Japan is an independent country and a sovereign country, it might reach different conclusions than the United States in what could become an existential crisis for both nations. So I'm not going to predict perfect alignment in the event of an actual war. I think we just don't know.
And also the case with South Korea, but can we really say that the level of pressure that Washington or Tokyo wants to pile on China is equally the same? There may be some different sense and nuance when it comes to pressure in China.
Maybe I should start this one, but let the real expert, Dr. Johnstone, who spent more time with those countries, correct and amend. I think the answer is that there's a difference. I think historically we have seen the Republic of Korea, which is attached by land to China after all, or at least one little river in between, fundamentally thinks about the problem differently. Now, in a given moment, on a given problem, with a specific government in Seoul, you might have alignment. For example, the Chinese economic pressure after the THAAD dispute of a few years ago. And now with a conservative government in place in the ROK, you probably have more alignment with the United States during this particular period. But I think South Korea, it looks at the world and looks at China a little differently than Japan and the United States would be my initial answer.
So
I basically agree with Dr. O'Hanlon on that point. I mean, the one thing I would say is I don't think this is a question of the United States trusting one ally more than another on the China question. The U.S.-ROC alliance, of course, is rooted in deterring, responding to the North Korean threat. That is now and will continue to be the foundation for the U.S.-ROC alliance. However, it's also the case that the horizons of the alliance are much broader than they've ever been before. When you look at the ROC Indo-Pacific strategy released under President Yoon, that very much reflects a broader regional view and a role for Korea well beyond the peninsula. The Camp David joint statement among the three leaders talks about a whole range of issues other than North Korea, including cooperation related to China. So I do think that there is convergence. I think there are differences, as Dr. O'Hanlon says, and certainly maybe more political differences on the China question in the ROC than there are in Japan. But I do think that there's some convergence taking place. And that is partly the explanation for why we're seeing deeper cooperation among the three countries, increasingly a shared sense of challenge.
Mr. Johnstone, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell said that a Biden-Kishida summit may announce measures to jointly develop and maybe jointly produce key military and defense equipment. Sounds like a very important and significant joint effort there. Do you have any information or any anticipation what kind of military equipment this could be? And would this lead to similar kind of collaboration with South Korea?
Yeah, I think the point to make first is that this is really a new area for U.S.-Japan collaboration. Historically, there have been a few cases of defense industry, defense technology cooperation. Ballistic missile defense has been at the heart of that, but not a lot. And that's partly a function of Japan's long-standing restrictions on defense equipment exports. That's beginning to change. That's part of Kishida's defense reform agenda. Hasn't gone quite as far as I think it could, but they've made significant progress. So that is opening up the door to new arenas of cooperation on technology. So you may see there are already efforts underway on things like the glide phase interceptor program to deal with the hypersonic challenge that Dr. Hanlon spoke about. There are other strike systems that we're considering working on. There's the Patriot missile system that Japan already manufactures under licensed production. So you may see some expansion of those efforts that's announced at the White House. But the other point I would make is the Korean defense industry is far ahead of Japan's. The Korean defense industry is a global player, providing capability in Europe, providing capability to Australia. And that is not the state of Japan's industry today, although that's certainly where they want to go.
Mm-hmm. Dr. O'Hanlon, Washington is considering restructuring the U.S. military command in Japan. There may be 4-star general in Japan, and the command and control capabilities of the USFJ could be strengthened to enhance coordination with Japan's self-defense forces. What's driving this change?
China, and to some extent North Korea. But I think that clearly, again, Mike Mansfield said it decades ago, the U.S.-Japan alliance is the most important in the world, and that was at a time when the Cold War was starting to ebb, arguably. At least we can see that in retrospect. And China wasn't yet what it is today. And North Korea didn't have long-range ballistic missiles or medium-range ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons. So if this was the most important alliance in the world 40 years ago, it certainly is now. And I think the idea of also encouraging Japan to keep normalizing its defense posture, which is something we would not really have wanted ourselves 40 years ago, is a major change. We're now twice as far beyond World War II as we were when Chris and I entered the field, when Mike Mansfield was making those kind of comments. People are starting to believe, I think, and I think even Koreans are starting to believe that Japan has changed. Understandably, it may take Koreans a little longer to fundamentally accept that reality. I believe Japan has changed fundamentally and no longer has to be a country that we view half as a powerful ally, but half as a country to be contained. Remember the old phrase about NATO when it was created by Lord Isby, that NATO was designed to keep the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. That used to be a little bit of how we thought of the U.S.-Japan alliance too, but I don't think it is anymore.
So ironically, North Korea, which criticizes Japan's defense buildup, is actually contributing and giving reasons for Japan to build its military.
I think that's true, but I think the rise of China is even more fundamental, although the two together is what really clinches the argument.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Johnstone, many experts say that U.S. and Japan would not establish a combined command that would look like USFK. Do you think the idea is for USFJ and USFK to complement each other? USFJ has strong Navy and Air Force, whereas USFK has strong Army.
Well, I think what this is really about is building a truly operational military alliance with Japan for the first time. I mean, when you think about it, right, the origin, just as Mike said, of the U.S.-Japan alliance was not about a military alliance with Japan really at all. Japan was a platform for U.S. operations in the region. And there was very little expectation or frankly desire to strengthen the role of Japan as a defense partner per se. That's of course begun to change. It's been changing for a couple of decades. But what has really, I think, crystallized the need for change is, just as Mike said, the rise of China and then Japan's assumption of real new capability that changes Japan's value as a military partner. the establishment of a Joint Operations Command for the first time to oversee joint operations of the self-defense forces, the acquisition of long-range strike capabilities. Japan will be the largest F-35 partner in the world once it completes its program. This is potentially a formidable military partner. And so it's natural that the U.S. and Japan think about sort of modernizing that command structure, which today is not combined at all. In fact, there's no joint operational commander on the U.S. side in Japan at all. So they'll preserve separate chains of command, but they'll move toward more integration. There are a variety of ways to do that. But I think what you'll hear from Kishida and Biden is a point in the direction of where they want to go, with more details to be filled out in the months ahead.
And Mr. Johnstone, should there be Taiwan contingency or any other contingency in the region, would USFJ and USFK be forced to operate together? What different roles would they play?
Well, the first point I make is if there was a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, there would have to be deep cooperation between U.S. forces in Japan and U.S. forces in Korea. Of course, our plans reflect that, but I think that's going to also become more complicated as Japan builds its own capabilities. Look, I think as I think about sort of the role of U.S. forces in Korea in a contingency, and I'm sure Mike has thought about this deeply, the bulk of our presence in Korea are ground forces that are probably not particularly relevant in a Taiwan Strait crisis. There's some air capabilities that could be, I think, important. But I think the most important role for USFK in a Taiwan crisis is to deter opportunistic aggression by North Korea, whether that's launched by the North Koreans themselves or encouraged by Beijing as a distraction. So I think sustaining deterrence on the peninsula through a robust alliance and robust U.S. forces in Korea will continue to be important, even in the context of a Taiwan crisis.
Last time we talked about this, Dr. Hanlon, you said USFK may have to give forces and equipment to that Taiwan contingency.
Yes, a couple of things. First, just to back up Chris Johnstone's excellent point, and this is sort of a nerdy, geeky point, but if you like the National Defense Strategy, I think it's page 17, where it basically codifies what he just said. It doesn't talk a lot about Korea specifically, but it says that U.S. forces are now being sized to be able to defeat either Russia or China while deterring the other, as well as preventing opportunistic aggression in other places. And when you think about it, what that presumably means is we don't want to have to pull our forces out of Europe to go fight China, and we don't want to pull our forces out of Korea to go fight China or Russia. We want to be able to maintain at least much of the presence that's there today, so that North Korea knows whether or not we could quickly deliver rapid reinforcement, war is going to involve us from day one. And therefore, please don't do it, because you know how this ends. It may take us a little longer, but we're still engaged in the deterrence of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So that's the most important point that I would make, and I think it's absolutely central. As to what the United States would do with ammunition stockpiles, with command and control, reconnaissance platforms, yes, there could be some effort to move some of that from Korea to southern Japan, for example. And also, it's possible that some of the shorter range combat aircraft based at Kunsan and Osan, the United States might ask for South Korea's permission to fly combat sorties from those bases, come back and refuel and rearm and repair and do it again. But that would be contingent on the agreement of South Korea, because obviously at that point, South Korea is more directly implicated itself in a war that it may prefer to avoid. So I don't predict what would happen in regard to the fighter aircraft. But I think otherwise, much of the combat force structure we would hope to keep in Korea and not use it in regard to China or anything else.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Hanlon, Mr. Johnstone, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.